In this video, I'll discuss what most SynthEBD users probably want to know: how to change the rules that determine which textures can go to which NPCs. As a reminder, you don't need to learn the interface to use SynthEBD. You can just install whichever config files you want and run the patcher, and you should get pretty good texture distribution. This video is for those who want to tweak and configure their settings to tailor NPC appearances to their specific taste. To edit these rules, we'll go to the Textures and Meshes menu and then select the config file whose rules you want to modify. I'll also give myself more space by toggling the full height config editor. The main thing to understand about config files is that they contain containers called subgroups, and each subgroup controls one or more textures or other assets. In the left-hand tree view, you'll see a list of subgroups, some of which can be expanded to reveal nested subgroups. The patcher will try to select one subgroup from each node in this list. For nodes that can be expanded, such as head diffuse or head normal, it'll choose one variant within the node. For nodes that don't have subnodes, such as head subsurface, it'll just choose that node directly. In order for a config file to be applied to an NPC, the patcher must be able to select one variant from each node in the list. If at any node it finds that all of the variants are disallowed for a given NPC, it will immediately skip that config file and move on to try the next config file you have installed. For example, if SynthEBD is applying this tempered skins config file to Ulfric, and it's able to assign a variant from head diffuse and a variant from head normal, but then finds you've set a do not assign to Jarl's rule for head subsurface, it'll immediately move on to the next config file, or give a no valid asset packs warning in the status log if there aren't any more config files for it to try. Let's dig into some of these nodes. We can click the arrow by head diffuse, which expands to show the different head diffuse texture variants available. We'll have a group for non-vampire NPCs, vampires, snow elves, and so on. You'll notice that the non-vampire subgroup is itself expandable. If you click on it directly, you'll see the preview window show all the variants within the non-vampire umbrella subgroup. After expanding that node, you can look at each subgroup within individually. Again, for each NPC, the patcher will pick one variant within each top-level node, so an NPC will get a head diffuse texture from non-vampire D1 younger, or non-vampire D2 elder, or vampire, or afflicted, or so on and so forth. Then it'll pick an option from head normal, and continue down the list from there. An important thing to note is that if a subgroup lives inside of an umbrella subgroup, it'll inherit all of the rules from its parent. So if you set a rule in the non-vampire subgroup, the D1, D2, D3, and Geonox stubbled subgroups will all inherit that rule, while the vampire, snow elf, and other neighboring subgroups will not. Now to the settings that govern the subgroup distribution. Each subgroup has an ID. If you're an end user, you don't have to worry about this. If you're a config author, you need to know that each subgroup ID within a single config file has to be unique, and there are convenient buttons to the right to auto-generate an ID for this subgroup, the subgroups within it, or all subgroups within the current config file. The name is just a descriptive label for the given subgroup, to make it easy for the user to know what it's controlling without having to click it and see the preview textures. Similarly, the notes are just there to jot down any remarks about the assets controlled by this subgroup. You might want to record why you set a particular set of rules to the textures controlled by the given subgroup. For instance, you might find a particular texture within a texture mod is of low quality or has a neck seam. You could make a subgroup for this texture so that users know you haven't forgotten about it, disable it, and write a note telling the user why you think it should be disabled. Now for the actual distribution rules. The first one, subgroup distribution enabled, controls if the patcher can distribute this subgroup. The only reason you'd want this unchecked is what I just mentioned. You have a texture that you want to keep track of, so you don't want to delete the subgroup, but you don't actually want it to get assigned to NPCs. One thing to be careful of is that if you disable a top-level node, like head diffuse, that would mean that no subgroups within that top-level node would be distributable, which would mean the whole config file would never be assigned. Next is distribute to non-forced NPCs. A forced NPC is one which you set in specific NPC assignments or using forced attributes, both of which will be covered in future videos. The key takeaway is that you're telling the patcher explicitly that you want this texture for that NPC. Uncheck this box for special textures that you don't want getting assigned to NPCs at random, so that it will only be assigned specifically when forced by you. Allow unique NPCs specifies if the given texture can be assigned to unique NPCs. These are typically named NPCs, rather than generic ones like bandits or guards. You can check if an NPC is unique by looking if they have a unique flag in SynthEBD. Conversely, allow non-unique NPCs controls if a generic NPC can receive the texture. The probability weighting controls how frequently a given subgroup will be assigned. This number will be compared against the probability of other subgroups within the same top-level node. For example, in this config file, the younger, elder, hardlife, and stubbled variants all have a probability of 1, so a non-vampire NPC will have an equal chance of getting any of them. This is ignoring any other distribution rules for the moment. If you set the elder probability weighting from 1 to 2, then non-vampire NPCs will choose from a 1 to 2 to 1 to 1 ratio. In other words, they'll have a 20% chance of getting younger, 40% chance of getting elder, and 20% chance of getting hard life, and 20% chance of getting stubbled. So this number controls the relative probability of a subgroup getting assigned compared to its neighbors. You can see the effect of this using the Simulate Distribution button that we covered in the previous video. You should see the distribution ratios start to change as you bump a probability weighting up or down. Next is allowed races, which should be self-explanatory. An NPC's race must be one of the allowed races for this subgroup to be distributed. If the list is empty, then all races are allowed. This is most relevant to head normal textures. In vanilla Skyrim, all races have their own head normal maps, and almost all texture mods have per race normal maps to match. Here you can see that the Dark Elf normal maps are restricted to Dark Elves, while Breton normals are restricted to Breton and afflicted NPCs. Don't forget that this setting respects the race aliases discussed in the General Settings menu video. We've also already discussed race groupings in the General Settings video. These are a shorthand way for config authors to specify collections of races. To see which races are included in a grouping, you'd click on the Race Groupings tab at the top of the config menu and expand the given grouping. There are also buttons to import additional race groupings, if any, from the General Settings menu, and also to add your own grouping if necessary. As discussed in the previous video, the race groupings list in the General Settings menu has a toggle that lets it override groupings of the same name with the definitions you set there. So if you want to add a race to humanoid playable for every config file you have installed, you can just do it in the General Settings menu and make sure that override checkbox is checked. The disallowed races and race groupings work the same way, but these block particular races from having the given subgroup assigned. In SynthEBD, disallowed is always dominant over allowed. The next settings are allowed and disallowed attributes. Attributes are at the core of how SynthEBD fine-tunes which textures can go to which NPCs. Because they're so granular, they'll be covered in detail in a separate video. As a preview, we can see that the younger diffuse texture has an allowed NPC attribute, meaning an attribute that an NPC has to possess to get this texture. This attribute is a voice type attribute set to male young eager, which means that an NPC has to have a male young eager voice type to get this texture. Again, we'll cover these in more detail later. The next option is allowed NPC weight range. As the name implies, this is the minimum and maximum that an NPC can weigh in order to get this subgroup. For example, if we set this from 25 to 75, then only NPCs with a weight within that range can get this subgroup. The next two options, required and excluded subgroups, are more for config file authors than for end users. Required subgroups specify other subgroups from the same config file that the NPC must also get if it gets the current subgroup. For example, the D1 younger diffuse texture is supposed to go with the D1 specular texture. The artist made them to match, and you'd never want it getting paired with the elder or hardlife specular variants instead. Therefore, it has the D1 specular listed as a required subgroup. You can assign these by dragging and dropping from the subgroup tree. Though I'm not showing it in the video, you can also click and drag subgroups within the tree. Left-click and drag moves the selected subgroup, while right-click and drag copies it. As an opposite to required subgroups, if there is a subgroup that must not be assigned to an NPC if it receives the current subgroups, it can be added to the excluded subgroups list. Next is add keywords to NPC. This is a feature that currently isn't used, but is a generic way for other mods to interface with SynthEBD. If you type text into the box, Any NPC patched with this texture will receive a keyword with that text. Again, there isn't anything which uses these keywords as of the time of recording, but it would be very neat if some other mod took these keywords into account to, say, distribute specific animations to hulking muscular NPCs versus smaller agile ones. Lastly, we have the asset paths. Most users will never need to touch these. They are for config file authors to dictate which texture or textures are controlled by the current subgroup. The source file is the texture file or other asset that will be assigned, starting with the game data folder as the root path. For example, here it's textures/tsm/the rest of the subdirectories/mailhead.dds. The config file author will set this to match how the texture mod author packages their mod inside of its archive. The destination tells SynthEBD where to assign this texture to. This is in the language of mutagen, which is the backend that powers SynthEBD. This is usually easily mappable to what you would see in SSEDit. Here it's saying for a given NPC, start with the head texture record. If there is no head texture, SynthEBD will copy it from its record template, which we'll get into in a minute. Once inside the head texture, the destination path says to go to the diffuse property. Finally, raw path is what points mutagen to the path shown here. With this destination path, SynthEBD will apply the texture specified on the left to the destination specified on the right. The color of the border indicates whether or not the path exists. If I mess up the path, you'll see it turns red, and if I restore it, it turns green. Likewise, for the destination, if I put in one that's invalid, it turns red, and if I restore it, it turns green again. The destination paths can look pretty convoluted, but there is a shortcut to set them. If you're trying to assign any of the standard body or face textures, you can click the Set Destination button and select the texture location you're looking for. That's all the options for subgroups. Next up, we have the Config Distribution Rules tab at the top. I won't go into the detail here because these behave exactly the same way as they do for subgroups, but they apply to the entire config file. If a given NPC doesn't match the rules set here, the patcher won't even bother looking at the subgroups, but instead will immediately continue to the next config file. The next tab is Asset Replacers. The difference between an asset replacer and a normal subgroup is that the replacer will only apply if the NPC already has an item at the specified destination position. This is useful for things that you want to apply conditionally. For example, the Tempered Skins mods ship with their own scar textures. You wouldn't want these to get distributed to every NPC, but instead only to NPCs that already have scars. So for this left gash replacer, it'll check each NPC at the destination path to see if they already have that scar texture, and only if it does will SynthEBD replace that with the Tempered Skins version. After checking if the NPC has that destination texture, any other custom distribution rules you set will also be evaluated. As I mentioned in the previous video, because the patcher has to evaluate every NPC to see if they have that texture, and it has to do this for every replacer, this can slow the patcher down a bit. Again, this has no effect on in-game performance, only the patching speed. But if you don't care about these replacers, and would rather the patcher run faster, the Textures and Meshes menu has a checkbox where you can disable all replacers. Record templates are another thing that's only relevant for config file authors. These templates allow SynthEBD to make new records like skins and texture sets for NPCs that don't already have them at the destination position. For example, if we're patching an NPC from Bijan Skins, it already has a worn armor record, so we can just patch that to make the new skin. But if we pick some unmodded NPC, its worn armor might be blank, so there won't be anything there to patch. Instead, SynthEBD will look at its record templates to find the corresponding object. The record templates are plugins that live in your SynthEBD settings. There's a default one that ships with SynthEBD, and which should be sufficient for all standard textures. If you need to edit them, you can drag them into your mod manager and open them in SSEDit, like any other plugin. If you're a config file author, and you're trying to make a plugin for non-standard textures, it's on you to make sure that you also make a record template where those textures already exist, and which SynthEBD can use as an example to learn how to patch NPCs, which don't already have those textures. You can see in the default record templates plugin, there's one for a humanoid male, another for humanoid female, and separate ones for the beast races as well. If you look at the default male entry, it has a worn armor. If SynthEBD is patching an NPC who doesn't have a worn armor, it'll look at the record templates for an NPC of the same gender and try to copy its worn armor before continuing on. If the NPC has a worn armor, but that worn armor doesn't include a torso for some reason, SynthEBD will copy the torso from the template and again continue on its way, and repeat this process all the way down to the texture path. NPCs will use the default template unless there's an additional template with a race that matches the NPC's race. The additional races paths is a generic way to tell SynthEBD where to add a patched NPC's race to a race list if it's not already there, which is required for that skin to not be invisible. Again, all of this info is only relevant to config file authors. I'll skip attribute groups for now and go into it in a separate video where I'll be focusing on attributes as a whole. We've also already discussed race groupings, so that just leaves us with the miscellaneous settings. The first two options will become relevant when we go into BodyGen and BodySlide integration, so I'll also hold off on discussing those. The only other setting here is telling SynthEBD to read a particular BSA file to find its texture. If SynthEBD can't see a source asset, it'll consider it an error and stop patching. But by default, it won't look for assets in BSA files. So if you package your textures into a BSA file to get it to load faster in-game, SynthEBD won't be able to see it unless you point out the plugin corresponding to that BSA in this list. SynthEBD has two ways to read BSA files. The first is to use the plugin name as a prefix for the source file. The Tempered Skins config makes use of this. Tempered Skins comes with its own head specular texture for beast race NPCs, but it does not come with head normals. To point SynthEBD to using the base game normal texture, you can just preface the texture path with the corresponding plugin name. In this case, Skyrim.esm. This tells SynthEBD to open up the BSA file or files associated with Skyrim.esm and look for that texture. If I remove this prefix, SynthEBD will look at your loose data files, see that it doesn't have a file at that path, and report it as missing. If we type the associated plugin back in, SynthEBD will find the texture in the BSA. Alternatively, we can go back to the miscellaneous menu and choose Skyrim.esm from the dropdown. Now for each texture, if SynthEBD doesn't find it in the loose files, it'll look for it in the Skyrim BSA files. Now you can see that even though there is no Skyrim.esm prefix, SynthEBD can still find the texture. At the bottom of the menu, there's a drop-down for associated BodyGen configuration. This is for if you're using BodyGen to distribute body shapes to NPCs. You'll probably remember an option to install these from when you were using the config installer, and it'll be a separate topic. We've already looked at the validate button for checking errors. Next we have save. If you're editing distribution rules, you'll probably want to click this periodically to save your progress. There's also a discard changes button, so if you made a mistake and want to backtrack, it'll reload from your most recent save. Next we have duplicate. If you're a config file author and you want to make a modification to a config file or use it as a template to make your own config, you can click this button and it'll make a copy. There's also a delete button which we can use to uninstall a config file. If you're using a mod manager, it'll also offer to delete the asset files themselves. In this case, since this is a duplicate config, and I still want these textures to be available to the first config, I'll select No. Auto set destination paths is again a function that's relevant for config file authors. It will look at all of the source file paths in the config file and try to assign the correct destination path based on the source file name. It's not foolproof, so I recommend giving all of your subgroups a check after using this function to make sure everything looks okay. The next button lists all subgroups which are disabled. This can be useful for users to quickly see if an author has any subgroups disabled. If so, you can navigate to those subgroups, and hopefully the author will have left a note specifying why those subgroups are disabled. The last button lists all subgroups with custom distribution rules. This is a quick way to see what rules the config author has set without having to navigate the whole subgroup tree. The pop-up box is pretty small, but you can click the white button to copy the text and then paste it into your favorite text editor. At the top of the editor, you'll have a drop-down box where you can select the config file that you want to edit. You can change the name of the config file. You can also change the prefix, which is really only relevant to config file authors. It affects the editor IDs of SynthEBD generated records, and can also tie into the texture paths expected by SynthEBD. The gender dropdown dictates if the given config will be applied to male or female NPCs. There's also a toggle for the config type, primary or mix-in. The bulk of the config files you download will probably be primary. These are intended to supply the majority of the textures that an NPC receives. For example, a primary config file is likely to have all of an NPC's head and body textures. On the other hand, mix-in config files will only have a small set of textures that are intended to supplement your primary configs, or provide specific textures if they are missing from the primary config. Each NPC can receive only one primary config file, but can get as many mix-in config files as you have installed. For example, on his Nexus page, Pomona has a config file for CBBE normal maps. This contains additional normal maps that can be assigned to NPCs on top of the main set of textures. If we select this config file, we'll see that it only has normal maps to control muscularity and not any diffuse or other textures. As mentioned in the previous video, the order of application is determined by the distribution order list. This determines if a mix-in can overwrite the textures from primary config files, or only supplements them if they're missing in the primary. In the config distribution rules for mix-in configs, the distribution probability is a percentage value which dictates the chance that an NPC receives the given mix-in config. If I wanted all eligible NPCs to get this mix-in, I would set it to 100%. Pomona set it to 10%, so 90% of NPCs would get their normal maps from their primary config file, and 10% of NPCs would have that overwritten by a normal map from this mix-in. That's it for config files, and we'll take a closer look at attributes in a separate video.